Welcome to the Epic Company Culture Podcast, where your host, Josh Sweeney, will give you, the business leaders, HR professionals, and company culture aficionados, the knowledge you need to take your company culture to the next level.
Hello, my name is Josh Sweeney, and welcome to the Epic Company Culture Podcast. This is Season 3, which is all about retention and company culture. Before I get started, I would like to thank Prototype Prime for this amazing podcast space, and my co-host, Crystal Sweeney, for being here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
So the topic of the day is all about employee retention and reinvention. We've been sharing in the last 4 episodes all about the generations. What are all of the great, amazing things about each generation? What are the factors that influenced each generation from the previous generation? And what we want to do today is really talk about reinvention and some of the things that we're hearing around different generations, why they came about, and what those factors are. So I'll get us started. There's a lot of pushback in society. There's a lot of naysaying and things about millennial generation, in this case, job hopping. And what we wanted to do is dig into how education is really reinforcing that and how it's come along over time. So think about this. What is the root cause of this job hopping? Well, part of it, one factor, is the ability for each person to reinvent themselves. So we hear a lot of people complain about job hopping, and we also hear some anecdotal items like, oh, well, they all seem to want it tomorrow.
Right.
So we hear these things as like negatives. But the reality is the educational space has changed drastically enough to make this feasible like never before. So if you think about the boomers and even into Gen X, everybody reinforced going to post-secondary school, right? Or going to college and getting a degree. And what you saw with the boomers was not only did they get a degree, but they got a job within that area of study, and they stayed there for a long period of time. And there was this mental stake in the ground that said, mental perception that said, if I ever wanted to do something else, I would have to go back to college and go back through that process, which is a cumbersome process, right? So now this has evolved greatly all the way up to Gen Z and, millennials in this case, but all the way to Gen Z, which is post-millennial. And what happens now is people have the ability to reinvent themselves virtually overnight. If I tomorrow woke up and said that I want to learn Mandarin and be a programmer in China, I could get started today, and in 6 months I could be there, right? I could move to China, I could know another language, and I could go to programming boot camp and reinvent myself completely. I could be a marketer, 1 year. I can be, in a totally different space another year, because we have information at our fingertips. Anybody can go to their day job. Maybe they were traditionally trained from Georgia Tech in civil engineering and they're working roads, but every night for 1 year, they learn computer programming. Well, 1 year later, they're a computer programmer. They just got a bump up in pay. Nobody cares that it was a civil engineering degree anymore. They just look and say, well, they went to Georgia Tech. They're educated in programming, right? So people have the ability to reinvent themselves, which I think is something that we kind of neglect to mention when we talk about different generations and what they want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a world where, the whole what do you want to be when you grow up, it doesn't necessarily have to be one thing anymore. Some people are still trying to figure it out. And I think with the information that they have, that we all have access to, you certainly can be whoever you want to be tomorrow, which may be different from a year from now, which I think is a great point. To bring it back to where, the generations, how does that show up in the different generations? Well, millennials, we talked about being the majority of the workforce in another few years. 87%, studies have showed that 87% of those really value their professional development. And of those, 16% are more likely to actually change industries altogether. So, they've got the resources that they need to be able to learn a whole new a whole new trade. I mean, we've got the boot camps that are available.
Right.
You know, I've heard a story of a lawyer who actually went in and wanted to be a programmer, and so he joined a 90-day boot camp, and he's programming and loving it. So, you know, things like that, being able to reinvent yourselves, I think it just kind of creates this atmosphere of, you know what, I can do what I want to do. I can be whatever it is I want to be, and don't have to be held within a certain box.
Yeah, and I think the challenge for businesses are, you know, if the business is run by, let's say, a boomer or even Gen X, is to really realize like that is the case. That's the mentality. And there's really a lot of data to back it up, right? There's all of these educational aspects out there. So putting somebody in one role today doesn't mean that they want to be in that role tomorrow. So you kind of have to take what you grew up with and whatever generation you might be in or from, and move that ideology along, right? You have to renew that ideal that you grew up with from the traditional education and say, well, what if I change my ideology and know that anybody can change industry, change jobs, become something else in the next 90 days? How does that change how I manage people? How does that change how I hire, how I build a company culture?
Well, I mean, I think what it comes down to is when you are trying to build a company culture and you're trying to find the right talent that fits a certain role that you're needing, then I think you need to look beyond, you know, the piece of paper. If they went to college, you know, look beyond that. I think it's more about discovering what is it that they want to do? What is their passion? What drives them? Because with everything that they have access to now, all the resources, they can certainly be that. You know, so, you know, if somebody has a degree in marketing and they want to be a developer and they're able to take a 90-day program and they've got the right personality traits and the right drive to do what you need them to do, then by all means, I think it's a good hire. So, you know, I think that's super important to keep that in mind, that you know, they don't want to be boxed in, and I wouldn't box them in as well.
Yeah, and you know, this season's all about employee retention, and we have to know that these are major factors in employee retention now, that, you know, professional development is a big part of that, and that people can switch at any point in time. I mean, I think about through my career, you know, there was instances where I wanted to switch job functions in an organization, you know, told my manager, hey, I want to make the switch over here. And they had lots of reasons, you know, mentally based on their belief system of why that couldn't happen. Oh, well, you've never done that job before and you haven't done this. And I'm thinking in the back of my head, well, I never did this job that I'm in right now until a year ago. You know, I was in a whole nother space before this company. So there's just this belief system that's there, and then, you got to backfill a position and, you know, all these different reasons why it can't happen. And what ended up happening there was I left the company and went and found that exact role at another company, was able to get a huge bump in pay, new benefits, you know, a lot more personal and educational growth through that new position. So as far as employee retention, we have to make sure that we're understanding the change and the need to change the belief system so that we can retain these employees.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly correct. I mean, you know, it's really figuring out what it is that they want to do, what is their end goal, what is their purpose. I know we've talked about purpose in previous podcasts. And a way that I think that companies can do that is that they can help facilitate, you know, a growth plan. You know, let's get together and figure out if they've got the right skill set and the right drive, then where do they want to be and how does that align with your company and your company values?
Yeah, definitely. So we will talk about this growth plan in our next episode. We hope that you enjoyed learning about how to change your belief system around education and how education and the on-demand learning environment has changed the entire landscape from a generational perspective and within your business and company culture. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Epic Company Culture Podcast with Josh Sweeney. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. For additional content and transcripts, visit epicculture.co. If you have questions or topics you would like us to address or expand on, tweet us at epicculture1 or email at podcast@epicculture.co.